Good afternoon, friends. Today we're very close to 365 days, 1 year spent in this crisis, this global disruption, the likes of which my generation and those younger than me have never seen. For some of us, the COVID virus directly took a toll on our health, or hastened the death of our elders, and settled an uncommon fear deep inside. Many of us suffer the unintended consequences of mental illness, isolation, accelerated dementia, suicide attempts, financial ruin, anxiety, family conflict. All of us are at risk of anger and bitterness settling into our bones. I don't want to minimize the impact of COVID on our lives, yet I want to share an observation prompted by this 1 year anniversary. There are two challenges I have consistently heard in my 20 years at Cardus. The first is this: actions are what counts, Michael. Ideas are just words. And the second, the public square is not the place for the faithful. These last 365 days, I believe, should put to rest these challenges. In all of my years of public life, this year has seen the most powerful expression of the power of ideas, the power of ideologies and worldviews that animate our actions. All the modeling, all the science, all the subsidies, all the news, all the color-coded frameworks, all of the debates about long-term care, all of it is animated by deeply embedded ideas and perspectives. I'm struck by the intensity and dialogue and debate about the future of this country, more than I've ever seen before. And these are not superficial questions or technical or frivolous. They're the big questions. Who am I? Who does what? Why am I here? What do we actually mean by freedom? And how do we live together in difference? Cardus is here for these very discussions. We've had this duty to public dialogue for a long, long time. So yes, words matter. Yes, faith and convictions matter. And this animates our very conversation today. It energizes us to credible research, discernment, and authentically seeking wisdom and judgment from diverse circles. So here are my two challenges to you, or for you. To Ray Pennings, to Lisa Richmond, to Johanna Lewis, and Brian Dykema, and our whole team off camera, help us, all of us, think through the challenges of our day in a way that's hopeful, that shows love one toward another to our neighbor, and that is deeply rooted in our faith and can withstand the test of many different voices. And to all of you joining us today, imagine what the public square will look like for you as we seek to put this year behind us and look forward with a sense of hopefulness. Decisions and judgments will be made that will not only impact you, but your children's children. I get the instinct to hide, to stick to our own, and to do the necessary workarounds. Yet we are a hopeful people, and we have such love in our hearts. We can share that in the public square, yes, by what we say and by what we do. For sure, we are a broken people and trouble enters our home as it does for others. Yet we have a beautiful view of the world. It is not bleak. It's not utilitarian or fatalistic or self-interested. Okay, let's get to work. I give you over to one of Canada's most thoughtful commentators, who knows the meaning behind the mundane, who reads the passions behind the politic, and for everyone he meets is an image bearer of God. Cardus, Executive Vice President and co-founder, Ray Pennings.
Well, thank you, Michael, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a privilege to be here and to be invited to share some thoughts. Let me first just begin by commenting on the title. I'm under no illusions that most of the people tuning in this afternoon have actually read the McKinsey Davos 2021 forecast. But the reason we chose this is Davos every January is host to a gathering of leaders from the business sector, from the government sector, and from the social sector. And that gathering each year produces sort of a signature report that influences governments and businesses the world over. And the purpose of forecasting, and the McKinsey people would tell you this themselves, the purpose of forecasting is not necessarily to predict the future. Whenever you make a prediction, you know two things. One is you're wrong, and secondly, you don't know by how much. Nonetheless, the benefits of forecasting is to discern trends, to discern data that helps inform our analysis of the present. A broad cultural intelligence, getting data from all over, synthesizing it into a coherent, manageable framework, assists us in our everyday decision-making. Whether we're a local business person, work in a regional or community association, represent one of the various levels of government, or a leader in your own faith community, whatever your role, good data helps you make better decisions in your everyday context. So what I want to do with you this afternoon is really three things. First of all, I'm going to give you, as objectively as I can, a high-level overview of four key 2021 forecasts that are relevant to Canada, starting with the McKinsey Davos report. I will just try to summarize them. Then secondly, I'm going to take a look at them together and try to highlight with you some patterns and key questions that might be kept in mind when we consider them. And then finally, I'm just going to leave you with four thoughts about how I think my own faith perspective informs my analysis in that. This follows, some of you were able to join us in January when we considered 10 policy considerations in the context of the post-pandemic reset. And I am going to use some of the same framework to do this analysis. So let me start with the McKinsey and Company report. As I mentioned, January 25 to 29, this year, instead of in person, it was a virtual gathering of about 1,500 leaders. And it was under the theme, A Crucial Year to Build Trust. If you read, there are hours and hours of videos online and various reports. There's one key document that sort of summarizes 8 themes that emerged. And I'll just try to provide a convenient summary and overview to get us going. The first theme that emerged out of this gathering was what they called stakeholder capitalism, and an emphasis that instead of globalization simply focusing to the most cost-efficient way, that one of the things that was emerging out of the pandemic and the post-pandemic era is a shift towards much more inclusive growth, much more attentive not just to growth numbers overall, but the distribution of that growth. The second theme they highlighted was the race to net zero, and certainly in the various forecasts that are there is real emphasis on the climate change issue. And certainly there is very little debate at this level about the science, even though that debate is happening in other circles. But generally taking the science as a given, there is an assumption that the move over the next decade or two is very much for government and business to achieve net zero emissions in the context of climate change. The third theme they identified was an opportunity for equality. One needs to keep in mind that every organization has its biases. The Davos is organized by something called the World Economic Forum. And back in September, they launched a website called The Great Reset. That has been the subject of significant debates. Essentially, the argument has been that the pandemic and the lockdowns has sort of put a stop on all sorts of things. And rather than going back to the way things were, we need to build back better with a new social contract that has equality as a theme. So given the fact that they're the authors of that, it's no surprise to see them highlight this certainly as one of the themes that emerged. The fourth theme focused around digital regulation and responsibility. There's an understanding that technology has influenced the way we live our lives in all sorts of ways. Certainly the economics, online purchasing, there's artificial intelligence, but there is also, Facebook, Google control, big tech companies controlling free speech. And there is a real discussion about we need new legal frameworks for social platforms. Fifthly, there was a sense of collaboration in the circular economy. Certainly in the context of COVID, borders have taken on new meaning, and the continuation and reliability of supply chains have become an issue in the past year, as they have not been in several previous years. And so there was a significant discussion about how open markets and supply chains are crucial to success. The sixth theme they identified was multilateralism, the need for global standards to support collaboration. Seventhly, the ongoing impact of artificial intelligence and digital, focused also on how this affects the global workforce. And finally, the equality of women and gender parity being at the heart of the recovery. In preparation for this event, I read not only the Davos reports, I read about 12 forecasts of the year, and many of them are relatively similar. Three observations came to my mind on this. As I mentioned, there has been an emphasis for some time on the Great Reset, and there is certainly an emphasis, whether it's talking about economics, whether it's talking about the environment, whether it's talking about digital, there is a predisposition in these gatherings to see global solutions, centralizing solutions as the answer to these challenges. Certainly this year's list, I compared it with previous years, seems to be very much emphasized in multilateralism. There's a lot of debate, as I said, about this, and a lot of people are concerned about some globalist conspiracy behind all of this. I take that, certainly there are areas of concern here. However, I would highlight the fact that many of the multilateral institutions, whether you think of the G21, you think of the United Nations, you think of NATO, you think of the various conferences and producing environmental targets, in the last couple of decades, most of them have not fared very well in terms of achieving their stated objectives. So it's easier to talk multilateralism than to do multilateralism is the first observation I would make. Secondly, I would highlight that there are some very strong ethical and ideological overtones to what was proposed at Davos. Some of this is idealistic virtue signaling, but there are substantial issues embedded. On the one hand, I welcome the discussion of ethics and values. There is a concern, especially that in recent years, that market capitalism, with its focus on short-termism and quarterly results, has resulted in some very unhealthy effects in the marketplace. However, I would counter much of what I read by the fact that creating a checklist of desired outcomes without a real framework of what constitutes flourishing or the common good has significant limits. Rarely, when you try to get particular outputs, do you achieve exactly what you want. Instead, a more healthy way is to look at the inputs of something to make sure they are healthy and working together, and that usually is a more effective recipe for favorable results. The third observation I would make is the increasing role that technology is playing in these forecasts. On the one hand, as the COVID-19 vaccine has demonstrated, science has huge capacities to do amazing things in very short periods of time. However, as the rollout of those very vaccines is also confirming, society itself is having a hard time keeping up with understanding of how to use science and technology effectively. The problem with Davos and many of these reports is that if we think of multilateralism and globalism as a harbor, there are both speedboats and big ships operating in that harbor. And while both may be watered vessels, their pace and their ability to turn quickly is very different. And much of what is proposed in some of these global forecasts includes things that move at very different paces. And largely these forecasts are silent on how the different institutions can and will adjust to the expected changes. So that's a global look at things. Let's come a little closer to Canada. I've got three very quick Canadian forecasts that I will highlight for you. Again, let's keep in mind of what these forecasts are trying to do. The Conference Board of Canada every year releases an economic forecast. This year, they highlighted a 2-year economic outlook, and its focus is to sort of analyze all the data and to provide some expectation for their members in the business community in terms of what is there. It was interesting to note that most of the forecasts, including the Conference Board, was premised on the fact that vaccines are not successfully going to be rolled out throughout Canada until the latter half of 2021. And that will result in something of a delay in the economic back to normal due to consumer uncertainty. Most of them anticipate it'll be a bit of time before the borders are fully reopened. And the primary adjustments are going to be felt in the retail sector as Consumer hesitancy continues to have a lot of people staying online. It will also have some impacts in the employment sector. So put it all together, what does this mean? Conference Board of Canada is predicting about a 5.3% GDP growth, which will effectively undo the contraction which was felt in 2020. What I find very interesting is that total savings in Canada, the money that was left in our bank accounts at the end of the year, was about $180 billion more than the previous year. When you stop and think about it, that's $5,000 of savings averaged last year for every Canadian. And the typical explanation for this is the fact that people didn't go on vacation, they ate out less, and consequently, there is significant savings that is sitting in bank accounts. One of the key factors in what is going to happen to the economy going forward is consumer confidence in spending that money. On what is that going to be spent, and how will that drive? That has a huge, significant opportunity to impact the economic outlook. The third thing they highlighted very much is government's fiscal capacity. Government has obviously been stimulating the economy and providing subsidies for businesses as well as individuals during this lockdown. The question is, how long can this continue? As long as all governments are doing it and walking in lockstep, and this is the big and, as long as interest rates stay where they are, our actual debt to GDP ratio is not that different than it was in the 90s. However, even just an increase of interest rates from 2 to 3 or 2 to 4% will have huge impacts given the size of the debt, and certainly would threaten the core programs that government is there. The final reality when you look at the Conference Board report, and it highlights that as well, is that while averages tell one story, the actual experience of most Canadians in specific sectors is going to be very different. Certainly in the hospitality sector, a lot of people in the retail sector are going, and obviously we have our continuing challenges in the energy sector. A lot of these sectors are going to be impacted very differently than some other sectors along the way. So it's going to be a very uneven recovery. A famous saying that's attributed, I Googled it, and there's actually several US presidents that supposedly made famous this slogan, namely that a recession is when your neighbor loses their job. A depression is when you lose yours. One of the impacts, if the Conference Board of Canada is correct in its process, is that the impacts of economic recovery are going to be felt very unequally in Canada. And that's not only given our size and geography, which always is a factor, but certainly also is going to be very industry specific. Moving thirdly to Export Development Canada, I picked this one. I always find Export Development Canada's forecast helpful for two reasons. One, their chief economist, Peter Hall, is somebody who I very highly regard. And if you're looking for someone to follow economic forecasting on a regular basis, Peter is a very reliable and insightful guy. Secondly, Canada's primarily a trading nation. So our economy is inevitably linked very much to what's happening in other countries in the world. EDC's for growth forecasts are slightly more pessimistic than the Conference Board. The Conference Board was predicting 5.3% growth, EDC 4.4%. Similar presumptions about vaccinations, a little more emphasis on protectionism. Peter Hall concluded his summary this way, and let me just quote from Peter. As the proverb goes, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Serial disappointments weighing in on the economy, testing patience and provoking dissent. But the proverb continues, desire fulfilled is a tree of life. Fundamentals still strongly suggest a return to growth in time to keep hopes from getting snuffed out, and it couldn't come soon enough. My own take on the EDCs is that our Canada's relationship to the rest of the world sets it apart from many other countries. On the one hand, being a trading nation has some negatives. Certainly, we have a lot of eggs in one basket, namely our trade with the United States, which actually means that when it comes to Canada, American forecasts are almost as significant as Canadian ones. Secondly, when you're dealing with trade, you're dealing with the reality of geopolitics, and certainly China, the Middle East, Brexit. There are a host of factors that have to be taken into account. And we have a world that increasingly is moving towards protectionism, and certainly COVID has only accelerated that. On the other hand, being a trading nation also mitigates your risk in that you're dealing with various countries at the same time. I would argue also, given the multicultural makeup of Canada, that Canada having a population that's a diaspora from various countries in the world certainly gives us an intelligence of what's happening on the ground in various areas and potentially a leg up in being an early identifier of markets. Let me move finally, and this will be the last forecast I summarize. It struck me that forecasts, and I realize the irony of saying this as a guy who works at a think tank. I chuckled earlier this week reading the Economist magazine criticizing McKinsey for being a step removed from the day-to-day world and being a bit in their ivory tower. And I thought it was a bit ironic coming from the Economist magazine. So I thought it would be helpful to balance this off by a public opinion survey. And there was an article in Policy Options in January by Andrew Parkin from Environics Research, and he highlighted various themes, 10 leading themes that had emerged in their surveys that he thought were provided an effective forecast. And I'm just going to run through them very quickly. The first thing he noticed is the world's a less friendly place. By and large, Canadians have the sense today that we have many fewer friends and we have many more enemies than we had before. Secondly, confidence in business is declining. In 1992, when you surveyed people in terms of who do you trust, business leaders scored 43% higher than political leaders. Today, they only score 8% higher. The gap's at 44 to 36%. Thirdly, there is a growing concern and awareness for the less well-off. There's certainly the themes of equality, which were present in global surveys, certainly were present in the Canadian survey as well. And one of the very tangible ways this also can be measured in the discussions and support for a guaranteed annual income. That support has increased by almost 20% and is certainly now in the mainstream political discussion. Fourthly, there is a growing awareness of a racism challenge. The concerns are highest about anti-Black, anti-Chinese, and anti-Indigenous attitudes among Canadians, but there is a growing concern that there are pockets of racism in the country. Fifthly, there is a slow progress towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. There is a slight increase in Canadian awareness of that issue and the challenges, but most think government should be doing more, but no one's really clear on what exactly that is. Sixthly, and I highlight this because this one really stands out from several other countries. In many countries, there's a fairly negative thought towards immigration, with the sense that immigrants, when they come to your country, are taking jobs from Canadians, if you will. That's not the case in Canada. In most regions of the country, Canadians actually have very positive views on immigration and view immigrants as coming and providing growth and opportunity, and are seen favorably, also as it relates to their impact on the economy. Seventhly, the whole notion of secularism and the place of religion, and this overtwines, in this case, particularly with Quebec. This is how the Environics people analyzed it. We have done some of our own polling and across the country, but just to stay with the Environics poll, generally, many of you will be aware that last year Quebec passed Bill 21, which forbade any public official from wearing religious symbols and sort of made the state very officially secular. What is interesting is that while it's portrayed that Quebecers are wholeheartedly in favor of it, it is the 55 and older crowd who is very strongly in favor, with 65% supporting secularism laws. Only 37% of those under 40 support those same laws. So there's a very significant generational divide happening in Quebec. And as that unfolds, we all get older a year at a time. That line, which somewhere is in its 40s right now, as that line moves up, I think we can look for significant changes in the makeup of Quebec attitudes on various things. Eighthly, moving out west from Quebec, the poll indicated that British Columbia is comparatively much less alienated from the rest of Canada. Digging into the numbers, I wonder whether or not BC continues to be alienated from Canada, but no longer in the same way as might be true in the prairie provinces, that there is a disconnect between the prairie provinces and BC. They used to be much more in the same, thinking the same in terms of their attitudes, and now that's changing. Number 9, climate change. Ordinarily, it's perceived that this is an issue which is very different in Alberta than the rest of Canada. I was a little surprised to see the numbers in this poll. They asked Canadians, would you, if you're forced to prioritize the environment over jobs or anywhere else? In Alberta, 47% prioritize jobs, 45% the environment, so almost half and half. In Canada as a whole, the priority for the environment's at 52% and jobs at 38%. While that is different than Alberta, it's not, it's only, if you allow for margins of errors, we're only talking about a 5 to 10% difference in Alberta and the rest of the country. This is much more a national conversation than just a regional one in Alberta. And finally, federalism. I found this one very concerning. They asked Canadians, does Canadian federalism have more advantages or disadvantages for your province? Right across the country, the numbers have fallen. Atlantic provinces have fallen the greatest at 25%. Quebec is at the lowest level at 40%, but right across the country, Canadians said that the disadvantages of Confederation were greater than the advantages for their province. And that was true of every region of the country. So how do we put all this together? What does this all mean? Well, I would suggest that the bottom-up temperature check suggests there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction within Canada, and there are concerns about not belonging. And there are significant generational divides, there are significant regional divides, and especially outside of Ontario, there's a growing sense of resentment and concern on a variety of files. So as we try to pull all this together and to wrap this up and to sort of set the stage for discussion, let me very quickly run through the 8 themes that I introduced in my December podcast on this, in terms of highlighting some questions we might ask. The first theme is reframing the common good. What I find interesting is historically we have had a morality, Western civilization has been based around the dignity of the human person, rooted in the historic concept of every person having dignity because they are an image bearer of God. There's a new morality that is driving this, a morality that is prioritizing identity, prioritizing equality, and prioritizing environment. It's proceeding from a different foundation. And the interesting thing is many of these assumptions assume a top-down centralizing approach to dealing with this. And, you know, I certainly think we have some lessons to learn south of the border. I read something last week in the United States where the majority of people now would not want their child to marry somebody from a different political party in the US. There is a growing sense of tribalism that is there, and we're no longer viewing all of our neighbors in terms of that sense of equality, but rather there's certain jargons, there's certain words, there's a very different sense of what the common good is and what it means to live together. Secondly, there is a question in terms of who does what. Many of the big questions, as I highlighted, whether it's digital, whether it's the environment, whether it's global standards, there seems to be a sense to bigger institutions. And I found it interesting, historically, where people live and the size, we've often thought of this as rural urban, not just in terms of the density of population, but a certain mindset towards the world. The Atlantic ran a column in the last month or two on the fact that the divide no longer is between urban and rural, but rather it's between what it called superstar cities, the big elite cities on the East Coast, the New Yorks, the Los Angeles, the Bostons, and the more livable cities. And it was musing of the fact that, and it backed it up with various numbers, there's a real exodus from the very large city to the medium-sized city, with a view to more livable standards and a different size of institutions. And I'm wondering whether or not we're seeing something of a right sizing and investing in the right institutions. Debt, I'm not going to spend any time on debt. I did a lot in December. The point is we are spending at an unsustainable rate. As long as all countries in the world are doing it at the same time and printing money, there's not a problem. But when somebody stops, it's like playing Monopoly. When you get to buy the property just before the bank runs out of money, you're in an obviously advantageous position. And certainly the timing of who is going to break the pattern of debt first and who ends up paying the bill is a significant one. Fourthly, technology and income support is changing the expectations of paid employment and the role it is having in regular lives. A lot of people have gotten used now to continuing to have an income and not necessarily having to go to work. The challenge is that's not just an economic question, that's an identity question. We're human. We are made to work. We're made to have meaning. And certainly there are a host of other implications that come when work is no longer the regular part of people's lives as it once was. Tied to that is a discussion about workplaces, technology, health, the cost of urbanization. Is this going to permanently change where people want to live? I came across this week a rather humorous, Owen Sound, Ontario just ran a advertisement for Toronto saying, now that you're telecommuting, consider working and living in Owen Sound. And they offered free pajamas to everybody who hit the link, and they were sold out within just a couple of hours. There is a lot of discussion about where people live and whether or not the big cities are what they were expected to be. Sixthly, refreshing institutions. The question is, are institutions more resilient than they're given credit for? There's a lot of change happening, whether it's the change in the role of government, the change in the workplace, the change in family. The question is, how are institutions going to adapt with these changes? The seventh I called performative polarization. And what I meant by that is the lack of civil discourse. We have a shrinking media environment. Most people read stuff that is targeted to them. They're reading, there's a lot of narrowcasting happening to people in a specific echo chamber. And the question is, what reliable media is going to emerge, and how are we going to have conversations, not just with those who agree with us, but those who disagree with us? And finally, I think the core question underneath all of this, and I think this is the biggest question of our generation, and that is, what does it mean to be human? As I mentioned at the outset, we have a civilization that's rooted in the view that man is made in the image of God, that humans are separate from the rest of creation. That has provided the basis for dignity and rights. Just think of the issues today, whether it's science, the drive to be able to, through test tubes and all that, create the perfect human, and to, the role of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of questions regarding agency. I'm thinking of what each person gets to decide. The current debate about medically assisted suicide or euthanasia, when you decide for others. There are ethical, medical issues, gender, identity issues. We could go on. But fundamentally underneath all of that is the fact that we no longer agree as a society on what it means to be human. And that's a pretty foundational question that people have to have some common framework if they're going to live together. Let me just wrap up with just highlighting 4 themes that, as we think about all of this, I find helpful. And You are going to get, I have created a memo summarizing my remarks, and all registered attendees of this seminar are going to receive a copy of this, I understand, at the end of this. The first theme is solidarity. Right when we open the Bible in the pages of Genesis, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Cain kills Abel, and God asks him about that, and he asks, am I my brother's keeper? And that question continues throughout millennia. Jesus' followers were still confused, and they asked him who their neighbor was. When we take a look at the forecasting themes, grand themes of equality, inclusiveness, on the one hand, they can sound inspiring concepts, but in reality, this occurs in the context of institutions and relationships, in our families, in our businesses, in our social clubs, in our faith communities. And what I find interesting is that in discussion of institutions, except for government and the markets, apart from that, the discussion of institutions and the roles of institutions in society are conspicuous by their absence in most of these forecasts. Let me just use a very tangible example of what I mean. Consider family. COVID-19 has provided a very valuable case study on how institutions contribute to relationships. Over the last couple of decades, we've had discussions in North America and debates about what marriage means. And historically, it has been marriage is the right to enter into a state-recognized contract with someone what you love. And it's a me first. It's been understood as a me first institution. I think what the pandemic has taught many Canadians is that family and marriage and family actually aren't me first. They're family first institutions. And that when push came to shove, when we were in trouble, families provided far more reliable support than government or any other institution. Tied to the principle of solidarity is a second principle, and that is subsidiarity. One of the things that struck me, and I read about 12 different analyses preparing for this, and there tends to be almost a top-down assumption of more multilateralism, more global institutions, more global standards. And at the same time, as the Environics poll and some of the numbers I shared with you demonstrated, at the same time, there's a growing sense of isolation. There's a growing sense of distance. There's a growing sense of disconnect and distrust. I would suggest that a subsidiarity approach, an approach that pushes decision-making down to the level closest to the individual, is a key approach that will actually result in diversity, choice, and trust and solidarity, and is way more likely to achieve some of the noble outcomes that are aspired for than top-down approaches. The third comment I would make regards limits. And there's two things here. On the one hand, there's limited government. The other is also the limits in terms of who's forgotten in all of this. What is striking to me as I read it, thinking about the pandemic, thinking about the fact that we shut down an economy presumptively because of our care for the aging and for the elderly who are most vulnerable to COVID in terms of mortality. We didn't succeed very well, I would note, but what is interesting is there's very little discussion of dealing with the disabled community, dealing with the vulnerable, the marginalized, the aging community. Indigenous issues, they get lip service. I would remind you that when this pandemic started, we were in the midst of significant economic disruption, not due to lockdowns, but due to Indigenous protests. And the fact that, on the Globe and Mail earlier this week, they listed 33 reserves in Canada that have third world water conditions. These are real problems that for the most part are not being seriously addressed. There are incremental proposals and there are some discussions, but certainly it's not part of our mainstream conversation, and I think it needs to be. The final thing that's conspicuous by its absence in all of this, in terms of the limit, is faith issues. The presumption here is that faith is an optional extra for most, but the global evidence is overwhelming. Faith motivates all sorts of good behavior, both good and bad, and you cannot do a serious analysis of what's going to happen with accounting for faith. Let me leave you with one final comment. Cardus seeks to do its work from the perspective of 2,000 years of Christian social thought. And as I was sharing some of my thoughts earlier this week with my colleagues, one of my colleagues commented that as I went through the resume of these various forecasts, and I talked about the importance of ordering our loves, using a quote from St. Augustine, she responded that, well, your forecast sounds like an ordering of our fears. We're trying to sort out how the competing challenges of pandemic, inequality, unsustainability, alienation, how they might be overcome. And I would say the privilege and the blessing of working from a Christian framework is that while we don't know the future, and there is good reason to expect much of it will be difficult, we can proceed with the confidence that there is a purpose, a meaning, and hope to life. We shouldn't just use this as a pious bookmark to mark our identity as being faithful. Neither is it an excuse for not doing the hard work of dealing with real challenges, but it does inform a posture of confidence that should shape our perspective and analysis. I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation that'll proceed.
Ray, for that great overview. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Richmond, and I'm the Vice President of Research here at Cardus. We're going to move into a discussion now, and I've got some questions that I prepared after reading an advanced copy of Ray's presentation. And I'll intersperse them with questions from those of you listening. If you would like to put questions in the chat as we go along, we'll see how many of those we can address as well. But first, I'd like to introduce my two colleagues who are joining Ray and me for this conversation. Johanna Lewis is a researcher here at Cardus. She's part of our research team. And Brian Dykema is Vice President for External Affairs. So to start off, and Ray, I think I'll ask you to respond first to this. You mentioned that the theme of the Davos gathering this year was a crucial year to build trust. So could you start us off by reflecting on the role of trust in the trends that you've mentioned in your presentation?
Trust is a key theme in the midst of all of it, and it probably worth reflecting for a moment on what exactly trust is. I think we know what trust is in a person-to-person relationship. You know, if my son asks me for my credit card for something, do I trust him with it? There is a sense of character that's assumptive in terms of the boundaries we put around each other in terms of relationship. In a social setting, trust is not just person to person, but it's mediated through institutions. And institutions are crucial to trust. They hold a trust that goes beyond the individuals who happen to occupy offices within those institutions. For many years now, the Edelman organization has been annually surveying, I believe there's 60 some odd countries in the world in which they do an annual poll of the trusts in all sorts of institutions. If you don't trust the bank, you're not going to put money in the bank. And if people don't put money in the bank, the economy doesn't move. So how do people trust the bank, the police, the courts, all the different institutions? I think it was 2017 when Canada, we're sort of in the top third worldwide, but we have been declining steadily over the last number of years. And there's sort of the magic 50% line where you move from a trusting to a distrusting society. And I think Canada moved there in 2017, if I remember correctly. So I think what is important in the context of trust is that this trust isn't just this warm sentiment in terms of, Lisa, you're nice, I trust you, we get along and that. No, it actually has to do with it's a combination of brand, it's a combination of performance, it's a combination of institution knowing their limits and knowing what they're not going to do, as well as the responsibility of what they're going to do. It has a very institutional focus. And what I found interesting is the Davos report that was highlighted about a year to trust basically talked about nothing but government and markets. And I'm not so sure that solutions that are based on those institutions are the answer to trust.
Brian or Johanna, would you like to jump in?
I'll jump in. I think the one thing that we've seen that what builds trust is when you say something and then you deliver on what you've promised. I think trust is something that is not purchased individually. It's something that happens over time. And I think one of the challenges has been during the pandemic, and one of the challenges will be going forward, is to rebuild some of the trust in some of the things that for a long time we had put trust in. So yes, there's been decline in trust in politicians going for some time. Janet mentioned in the question box, her surprise at the decline of trust in business, but that's been happening too since 2008 after the financial crisis. And I think what is common to both of those things is a recurring pattern of promising one thing, saying one thing, using analysis to say one thing or to make the case for one thing, and then having something totally different happen. And I think that speaks a little bit to one of the challenges that I've seen arise in the course of the pandemic, is the use and sometimes abuse of empirical data, and something that we're interested in here at Cardus. But I think that sometimes even not admitting that you don't know, or being aware of the fact of your limitations, is actually something that can build trust. And when you try to promise a little too much, or when you try to be a little too clairvoyant with numbers that perhaps might not actually tell you the future, and those things don't turn out, I think that diminishes people's trust. And I think you're seeing that in the business community, and certainly it's common in politics. And so I think something worth considering as we go forward from here.
Okay, turning now to one of the themes mentioned, having to do with enabling greater inclusion. So this implies that there is something to be included into. And Ray mentioned that in our society, we don't have a shared, clear conception of the common good. And Johanna, I was wondering if you could comment on what you observe in these trends that have been identified about the underlying assumptions about how the common good is being defined in our society today, and that might be implicit in these calls for greater inclusion and equality.
Yeah, my sense is that inclusion is usually understood implicitly in primarily economic terms. So including women and marginalized groups in the labor market, for example, or helping the poor be included in society by improving their income equality. And this is because human flourishing is framed implicitly in economic terms as well. And of course, economic inclusion is important, but as Christians, we can agree it misses so much of what it means to be human and to flourish. To borrow one of my favorite quotes from Jordan Baller, man does not live by GDP per capita alone. And then when it comes to policymaking, approaching inclusion as a primary economic issue can very easily lead to the temptation to reduce human beings to data points. And economic decisions are framed as neutral technical arrangements rather than moral judgments. And this can tempt leaders towards abdicating their responsibility to make those tough judgments by saying, oh, we're just following the data. We plugged the numbers into the formula and the formula told us what to do. But as Ray pointed out, these proposals and these trends, they have very strong ethical and ideological overtones. So we are having a conversation about morals and values, even though we're not really admitting it.
I think if I can just jump in and put an exclamation mark on what Johanna just said, usually morals and values are sort of seen as static things that we get from way in the past, and they're not there. But morals and values are something that every generation has to own for itself again. In that sense, there's a vibrancy and a life to them. They're not things we just get from old books. They are things that have to be struggled with, owned, and applied to the issues of the day. And that's why we may not live by GDP alone, but even in our understanding of GDP, we need to go to old books and old principles, understanding the core beliefs that undergird them, and then saying, what does this really mean for today and for today's context? And that answer, the application of those, is very contextual.
Great. Following up on that, further question on inclusion and the vulnerable, the theme that we were hearing about on that topic. As Ray noted, the argument for the COVID lockdown has been premised on caring for the vulnerable, most likely to be seriously affected by COVID or to die from it. And at the same time, I've been struck by the fact that we've had hearings in Parliament about Bill C7, the MAID expansion for physician-assisted suicide. And individuals and groups who've been very vocal about how, in their view, this would disproportionately affect the vulnerable in Canada. So my question is, and maybe I can ask Brian, where are we at in our society currently with regard to our consensus or thinking about what it means to safeguard the vulnerable? What trends do you see in that area?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to the trends because I'm not clairvoyant, but I think what we can say though is that there's a sort of deep incoherence to where our society is at on that question. I think that, you know, on the one hand, we've seen lockdowns have rightly been done to, you know, when you take it all away, at the end of the day, they're there to protect those who were most vulnerable. And in this case, the most vulnerable to COVID were those who were older, to those who were, you know, above 85, which is why in Ontario, and I know in BC and in other provinces, those are the first people getting the vaccine. So you have this massive social effort to protect the lives of those people. And I think that's a wonderful thing. At the end of the day, I think, you know, we can argue over whether we've done it right and so on, but that impulse is a good one that we want to affirm. At the same time, we're seeing bills going forward that people who are elderly, people that are disabled, are very, very worried about, that they themselves are saying, look, this is actually moving far away from the original intent of that. And I think it's reflective of a deeper incoherence in our society about what it is we value. Is it the human will itself that we value, or is there something beyond that? You know, I think too of some of the work that we're doing here on disability, some of the work that other people are doing on disability to allow for greater inclusion in society and the workforce and so on. And yet we still have an understanding of assisted suicide that is being expanded and that's deeply concerned to disabled people. So I don't know what the future holds, but what I can say is that there is, I think, more reason to have hope in the sense that our whole society has been largely willing to bear the costs of lockdowns and other things to protect those who are old and those who are vulnerable. And I think that's the mark of civilization, that a civilization that cares for those who cannot care for themselves is a healthy one. And one of the things that I hope comes out of this is that we return to that deep concern to protect those, and that we see that in other structural places and laws across the country.
I think as well, another sign of hope in terms of the vulnerable and the pandemic is the way that the pandemic has just forced the world to pay attention to the vulnerable. I think it's especially in long-term care. So much of long-term care happens, you know, out of sight, and it's very easy for all of us to forget the vulnerable, to whom, you know, we have responsibilities as a society. And the pandemic is now finally forcing us, you know, to pay attention.
I think that's a great point. I agree with that. We've had a question from a listener raising some of these same questions and concerns, and also asking about guaranteed income or universal basic income. So perhaps, Brian, I can ask you to start on this one again. So that theme was mentioned in the Environics data, and I know that there was recently a report issued in BC on this, and I think a private member's bill in Parliament was introduced last week about studying this issue. How should we be thinking about this policy option? Is it a good idea? Will it help? Would it help the most vulnerable in our society?
I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think if you're talking about a universal basic income that every Canadian citizen would get regardless of their status, their health, their employment situation, I think it's, I mean, I can quite clearly say that would be a terrible policy and an expensive one, but also one that wouldn't be very helpful. If the question though is, and I think we have to, so we can put that aside, but I think the real question is, how do we provide a basic income for those who cannot earn their own way or do not have the supports in such a way that their dignity can be preserved? And I think that's a question worth asking. And I think what's important when you're asking that question is to look at our existing structures and our existing policies of say disability supports, just to go on the theme that we've been talking about thus far. Johanna and I, when we've been looking at it in our research, it is a labyrinth that is very, very difficult to navigate. And it also doesn't provide enough for people to thrive. So we have a situation where they can't work and the income given to them is not enough to help them thrive or even to live well. So I think it's worth looking at how we provide support, how we provide income support to those who are unable to work, and finding ways to simplify it, finding ways to make it sufficient. But one of the things I would note too is that, going back to Johanna's point about income not being enough, I think a lot of these challenges often arise where they're the worst, or they're exacerbated when people aren't connected to other communities like families, churches, ethnic communities, and so on. And we've seen that in our research, that those who have strong family supports, that have strong neighborhood supports, are also the ones that tend to be doing the best in terms of quality of life and so on and so forth. And so, you know, as we think through things like UBI, and as we sort of work to ensure that those who are most vulnerable are taken care of, we simply cannot forget those other structural supports. Those are critical. And if we try to do it simply with cash, and again, don't get me wrong, cash is important, we are going to miss something, and we're actually going to, the policy will undermine itself in the long run, I think.
I would just add, and I agree with you, Brian, I think one of the frameworks to look at it is, you know, that no matter, if we believe in the dignity of every person, then we need to ensure that the basic needs are met and they have enough in terms of living. But I think we shouldn't define people by their disability either. And I think that's one of the challenges that many of these programs have, is that they are entirely defined by their disability without considering what they bring and what they contribute to society. You know, we have someone with Down syndrome in our extended family, and he brings something pretty unique to the family. And I think anybody who knows a Down syndrome person, and one can go through a variety of things, they bring something very positive. And it, you know, every time I read some of the material, Iceland, for instance, is celebrating the fact that I think they are pretty close to having no Down syndrome babies being born right now. And that's, you read the report on it, it's being celebrated as a good, and I read it and I say, what a loss that is there. And we're not looking at the gifts that are brought to society by people who may not fit every definition of normal that is commonly assumed.
Let's talk about institutions for a bit. Ray, you talked about investing in institutions and making sure they're healthy. So Johanna, maybe I could pitch this one to you. What do you think COVID and the other trends that have been mentioned are revealing about various institutions and society's strength, resiliency, or perhaps lack thereof? I think Ray mentioned something about how we've all realized that a family has been a essential support during COVID for many people, and they've renewed their appreciation of family. I'm just wondering, what else, what have you observed during this last year?
Well, to continue on the theme this conversation's kind of taken, I think this pandemic has exposed our need to invest more in care systems and those who care for the elderly and, you know, people with disabilities, other vulnerable people more generally. There's pretty much universal agreement at this point that frontline care workers like PSWs, nurses, but also family members are overworked, underpaid, and their work is undervalued. So we need to be investing, I think, as a society in these care workers more at every step of the system. So that means home care and long-term care and palliative care and community living systems for people with disabilities, for example. And we also need to strengthen the communities, the families that provide care on an unpaid and often unnoticed basis, because it's all works together in one system of coherent supports when it works well.
Can I jump in there too? Because it sort of gets at the bit about trust and structural change and so on. We've built, like, just to take the long-term care, we've built a massive structure where we effectively warehouse people who are old and infirm. And that doesn't work. It's not humane in most cases. And I know there's lots of good work being done there, but there are better ways to do that, where the state can support institutions that are already doing that work, and it can set up a structure that looks differently. And I think this is the challenge. I think a lot of people think when they hear the state gets involved, they think big, universal, single, and instead of thinking it in terms of a partnership with existing communities. And so I think that's true in the care sector. I think going back to Ray's earliest point about, the Davos crew saying, we want, stakeholder capitalism. What that means actually is we need to rethink hard questions about structural access to credit, structural access to capital. And I ultimately think that means that the people who show up at Davos will look very different if they took that seriously. I know that's some of the work that we're trying to do here, but that's how you build trust. You actually take the needs and you look at the needs and you adapt institutions to meet those needs in ways that enable rather than absorb the existing communities on the ground. And I think that's one thing that we're seeing, whether it's on childcare, whether it's on education, whether it's on care for the elderly, that smaller communities on the ground are actually far more capable, far more resilient. And yet, when you look at the structural effort being put into it by the state, it doesn't reflect that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to turn it around. And that in turn can rebuild trust in political institutions, and insofar as others like businesses and so on are able to capitalize some of those things, rebuild trust in those places as well.
We got a question from a listener talking about institutions. What are your observations on if and how COVID is creating an inflection point for the church? And what do you predict that this might look like over the next 3 to 5 years? Who would like to take a stab at that? Ray.
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. Obviously, we can answer that in terms of the church's place in society as a whole, and then the church's understanding of herself and how that internally functions. I think it is, it's significant. I think there are now 14 cases or so of churches in conflict with the law regarding violating public health guidelines. There are various court cases ongoing and understandings. And one can agree or disagree with the tactics. Obviously, faith leaders themselves are divided. A good number of churches have been following the guidelines very strictly and have not been gathering physically for corporate worship and have gone virtually online. Others are saying, wait a minute, if the groceries, I've been able to buy my groceries online, and yet I still can go to the grocery store as well. Similar allowances need to be made for church because spiritual food's as important as physical food. There is I think the other aspect of society that I don't think, the mental health challenges that are there are very much tied to the lack of community in that. And for 11% of the population, that involves attending church weekly. And for about 20 some odd percent of the population, at least monthly, they are part of identifiable faith communities that are very important in their lives. They're probably outside of the workplace. Faith communities are the most significant networks of people that regularly get together. And there are all sorts of needs and functions that are there. So I think there is a real challenge that is there in terms of how society understands faith and faith communities that is emerging, and the disconnect. Not faith. I noted the fact that faith was absent and faith institutions were absent from every one of these. I read 12 forecasts. I did not read a single one that made mention of faith, not just in its religious, but we did a study. I think faith contributes $67 billion to GDP in Canada per year. Making it, Brian, you would know the numbers better. It's what, the fifth or sixth large. It was one of the large sectors anyway. There are all sorts. That fact is totally ignored. I think the other fact is an internal fact. I won't take too much time on that, but church leaders themselves are being challenged as churches have to rethink the nature of their relationships. And there are divisions within churches in understanding what is most important and what is most essential, what's available online. And I think it has posed a significant challenge to church leaders. And I fear There's going to be a divided response. It's going to make some churches much more stronger and focused on the core things that hold them together. And it is unfortunately also going to divide some faith communities. And I think we're going to see some messy consequences within the faith community.
Can I just add one point too? One question that, throughout this whole question about the church and its relation to the state and some of the lockdown orders and so on, one question that has been going through my mind, and I think this is something we're learning elsewhere economically too, but is what would have happened into the North American or the Canadian church in this case if we were built like the Chinese church? Would we have been as concerned if we were built like the Chinese church, which is technically outlawed and yet has grown leaps and bounds? It's a question that really, like, what can we learn from those other places? And I think that there are lessons to be learned there. There are lessons to be learned in how we structure even our own faith institutions, and what does it mean to have a vibrant faith community, and what's its connection to the law and the state that I think are worth paying attention to. Just something to think about.
I want to turn to the theme of technology. And on the one hand, this last year has demonstrated this amazing ability of the global scientific community to develop the COVID vaccine so quickly. And that's such a marvel of our technological power as a civilization. Yet in other respects, our technical powers or technocratic powers have appeared over the last year to be suboptimal. And I'm thinking in terms of the difficulty of getting people vaccinated, the rollout here in Canada has been particularly behind what was hoped for. But also in terms of the lockdown, the rules and the guidance and sort of the frustration with sort of shifting rationale or shifting explanations. How can we think, do any of you three want to start off with a response to just on this general question of sort of the technology human nexus, if I could put it that way?
I think it shows that we're good at science, and that the idea that political science is a science is a total pretense. And I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, if you look at Francis Collins and his team, who by the way is a Christian and thinks very hard about these types of things, that team is incredible. The ability to get a vaccine discovered, made, put together, and actually was a very, very short period of time. And as much as I'm griping about the length of time it's taking to get them here, it's still an incredible thing. It's like the person who complains about not having enough internet on the airplane in the sky. Maybe you should think about the fact that you're on a can in the sky. But there's a sense in which politics is not a science. And Johanna alluded to that earlier. You need science to help govern. You need science to help inform your decisions. But at the end of the day, you are making judgments about communities in contingent circumstances between a variety of goods. And I think, again, going back to the trust thing, being clear with people about what you're valuing, why you're making decisions, and how those tie with empirical science is critical for building trust. I think, in general, I would say our leaders have done, at least a B job. I don't think we can give them an F or an A, but I think there's plenty of room for improvement on that. And I think part of that just means, and I saw that one of the questions in the panel is actually when we're teaching people to lead, when we're teaching people to lead institutions, or we're teaching people to lead businesses or governments, those type of judgments are always going to be present. And you need to do as much work equipping them to judge well as you do to help them understand statistical analysis and methodologies. And I think that's one of the things that's being shown here. And I think is a need in the sort of training schools of leaders in this country.
If I can jump in on that one, what I find interesting is, while on the one hand, the science that is done by the people in lab coats and the nerds behind computers has been remarkable and all the rest, the public's use of data and the ability of them to share that data, and I think I think of the modeling that has taken place regarding COVID, and what is remarkable about it is, number one, how wrong it is, but secondly, how it has been misrelied on. on the one hand, if you've taken courses in statistics and modeling and everything else, you know that modeling is just one tool and there's a host of other factors that are there. And yet what is happening is we are taking our daily reports out of modeling and we're putting, 4 numbers, cases, and we're putting 4 numbers day by day on the front page of the newspaper as if that is supposed to equip us to understand the reality. And no, it's just a very narrow piece of data with much larger frameworks and everything else. And yet our media itself and our public health officials and those who have been promoting the modeling are highlighting science as if it gives them an authority to say something that the science itself would say you should not use it this way. So I think it's a very interesting commentary on our own understanding of science. And I think much of it comes from the vacuum of illiteracy is because we do not have theological or moral language. And therefore, somehow, if I can put a number to it, it sounds way more authoritative. 87.4% of statistics are made up on the spot, but that sounds authoritative, right?
This is a good connection with a question that came in from Edmonton. How can the academy be reformed to better equip young minds with skills of critical thinking and moral judgment, for example, between top-down versus subsidiarity as frameworks for society? So starting from an early age with the children in school, how can we develop the next generation of Canadians to be able to lead and address these very challenging issues? Sounds like this may be the hardest question so far.
Well, like I think I alluded to it earlier, but I think we have to give up the pretense that that science will answer all questions. We need to recover the very scientific insight that science is limited. And just a little shout out to Dr. Sarah Hammersma, who's a professor of public policy at Syracuse, I think Syracuse University. She wrote a really great piece for us and comment on statistics and uncertainty, and actually how beautiful that is, that you're actually building in certain frames of recognition of areas in which you have to make judgments. And I think that that's a critical point. And the other thing is to say that it's not wrong to judge. It's not wrong to judge between things, that there's a recognition that human life is complex, it's complicated, and because it's so complex and complicated, it's beautiful. And that those who are making, I think, the hard decisions have a very high bar on themselves. There's a sort of certain sense that they have to cross a high hurdle, but that's a magnificent thing to do that well. And I think that there's, we could spend a little bit more time looking at people who have made hard decisions with costs to them associated with them, and are sort of stuck with them, and then it has turned out well and has done well, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. So I'm not sure if that's going to reform the academy. That's beyond my pay grade. Maybe that's Johanna's pay grade.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes.
I'll jump in on that one very quickly. And I think that on one of the challenges of the academy is the fact that it has become such a significant credentialing aspect, and we have focused on the credentials rather than the actual education that takes place. And there's an entire ethos around that in society, which I think is very problematic. I also think the old, and this deserves a much bigger discussion, we're able to give it here, but we effectively don't have universities today. We have multiversities in which people are in the confines of their own disciplines, and there's not as much interdisciplinary liberal arts sort of approach that I think is essential, and that gets at that I think is consistent with some of the themes that Brian raised earlier.
So we have 4 minutes left, and questions are coming in thick and fast. I don't think I'll be able to get to all of them, but here's the next one. We have not gone back to the theme of the Federation and federalism in Canada. So a question from Montreal: do you see any commonalities across the provincial spectrum on which to renew or rebuild our confederation. I see a federal government that wants to centralize more and provincial governments that want to decentralize. Plus, we have the challenge of settling the First Nations issues at the same time. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in very quickly. Canada has always been a bit of a conundrum. I always, on the one hand, if you take a look at the natural patterns in North America, they're north-south, not east-west. The 49th is a very artificial construct. And in many ways, if you take a look at our history, we are defined by who we are not and what we did not want to happen. The English and the French were fighting wars in other parts of the world. We decided that, English Protestants and French Catholics were going to have a peace treaty and we were going to get along. And we had confederation. It's a bit of a over-reduction of the 19th century, but, Lord Durham, two nations warring in the bosom of a single state and carrying that all the way, you can go from the Quebec Act all the way to confederation. You can trace something of that line there. So we are challenged very much, and I think that continues to hold true. I've been privileged to live in Alberta and Ontario. And, on the one hand, the people are the same there, but there is a different ethos, even in terms of understanding. And as you travel around the country, someone in British Columbia has a different connection or lack thereof than someone else. And, the irony is outside of the core cities of Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, the rest of the country is probably most united in the fact that they're not all that keen on the Laurentian elite and the people who they think represent the country, and everybody else is sort of united in their opposition to it. But that's the key. We're united in opposition to things, but in terms of that real dream we've had, Pierre Trudeau's Just Society, we've had various attempts to label it and to inspire. But the substance of what has held us together as Canadians has not been that carefully, has not taken those deep roots. And I think that will leave us, at least for the rest of my lifetime, with significant challenges in that regard.
Yeah, I don't agree with that, Ray. I think that I think there's a lot more holding Canada together than you think. We do have common laws that we hold together. We have a constitution that we may bicker and fight over, but that's fairly typical in a family, and sometimes is indicative of a healthy family that there's bickering and fighting. I think there is a common, a love of, although that's being challenged too, but Darcy McGee, when he talked about his vision for the nation, it was one bound together, just dispersed of a variety of communities, disposing of their own affairs, but bound together by free intercourse and commerce and the rule of law. And I think, we have troubles with free intercourse between our, in our academies and so on, but I think it's largely still there. You can say what you want in this country, and that's protected by law, thank God. Free commerce, we need to do some work on to get, the fact that, we can trade across borders, and that I can buy my BC wine as cheaply as I can get it. But we are still bound by that. I think there's more to it. I think the people who are too quick to dismiss the Canadian identity and say that we're, somehow only bound together by things we're against are missing the point, and they're missing, I think, over 100 and some years, 150 years of a successful, rich country. And so get on the train, Ray.
Yeah. Well, I'll just and the National Railroad and the deal that created it, in fact, is one of the great accomplishments of history. But the irony is today we can't build those sorts of national sort of things because we have different parts of the country focused more on the impact locally as opposed to the pan-Canadian answer. I do, and I'm with you in part in the sense I don't think the country's about to fall apart or everything else, because you have to take a look at the country over against the alternatives that do exist, which even in terms of what we are against, it was deemed Canada was better than the alternative that was there. But I think and we can continue this debate undoubtedly offline. But I would say that Canada continues to, it does not have, when I go to the United States, there is a different ethos that unites Americans. And right now they're divided over what they understand that to mean. but it's still, both sides have a very American understanding of that. And within a Canadian setting, I'm not sure we have quite the same thing.
I was given a couple more minutes, so just to close us with a few questions remaining. Will the pandemic be transformational long-term? What changes, Brian, I'll ask you to reply to this. What changes from the pandemic do you think are long-term, and in what ways are we going to just be able to go back or want to go back to the way things were before?
I think it'll be transformational, but I'm not sure it's going to be revolutionary. I think all this talk about resets, great resets, and new starts and so on, I think are wishful thinking. And people who are worried about sort of conspiracy theories, I think, have a little bit too much trust in the ability of governments and other big players to pull that type of stuff off. I think there are going to be changes at the margins, and I think things like travel, we've talked about that even internally at Cardus, that it is far easier to do a meeting across the country, just like this one that we're all on together, than it would be. But I think those will only take up a marginal change. I don't think it's going to lead to the fact that 90% of our meetings are going to be on Zoom and so on these days. We're human beings, and there are certain patterns that are there. That are going to be there. I think the biggest one that we're going to have to deal with is one that was already started before COVID, and that's the certain challenges of nationalism, supply chains, and some of the global affairs and some of those alignments. But otherwise, I don't see this as being revolutionary. I see it as being transformational, but in the same way that normal historical contingencies would be.
Okay, and then for a final question, I think I'll ask Johanna. Let's end on a note of hope. What are some areas covered by these trends that you think offer signs of hope? And have you heard of any specific policy initiatives or community or business initiatives that you think are promising or that you believe will be helpful?
Well, we've talked about, on a global scale, there's obviously the vaccines are huge. The pace of vaccine development is just a great example of a large scale rallying of resources for the common good. The power of cooperation at a global scale leveraged towards positive end. And we've talked about, the lack of trust in elites to a certain extent, but we can see those Davos level leaders working together to do something that benefits all of us. On the other hand, we have a lot of trends that are multilateral, global in nature. But I wonder if staying close to home has brought a renewed appreciation for immediate local communities, which is, I'm optimistic that will drive a renewed hunger for subsidiarity and an appreciation for the advantages that subsidiarity brings. We have our families and our neighborhoods, the small businesses down the streets. We're paying more attention to those things now that we're kind of stuck in one place. So yes, there's kind of a sense of alienation, concerns about not belonging, divisions within Canada. But at the same time, I'm sure we can all think of examples of the past year from, when we saw people loving their neighbor in small ways, an encouraging phone call, dropping off groceries, extra moments of grace for the challenges of taking Zoom meetings with kids at home. These are the kind of things that go almost entirely unnoticed, but I think can really contribute powerfully to genuine renewal. As somebody who got married during COVID, I can say the support from immediate communities and from family and friends and being plugged into institutions was brought to life to me in a whole new way, from being forced to rely on not mainstream supply chains or businesses, but on the people close to me.
Any other final thoughts, Ray or Brian?
I agree with what Johanna said, and I think while it brought to light a reevaluation of the rat race life that many of us were leading, and in various particular ways is the sort that Johanna went. But I also think in terms of overall balance between our economic lives, our family lives, our faith lives, our community lives, and the importance for rest and leisure in the midst of it all. And while I don't think any of us will long for another year of lockdown and all the restraints that are there, I do think it opened our eyes to some things that were unhealthy in our lives, and hopefully will give us an opportunity to adjust to something normal that's new that's a little more balanced.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation for me, and I hope for everyone who's been listening. So, Michael, back over to you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. You know, I've just been getting inundated with notes, a little bit of a joke here, but I promise you, I know you're all worried about it. I will kind of keep my colleagues from kind of getting more expressive about some of the kind of anxiety that was just kind of emerging about there. And Lisa, you kind of put it back down. Thank you very much for keeping them in check. Just another little thought. One of the questions that came out, we didn't have time to get at it, and it was asking the question, what about the next generation? Are we going to be able to find and build and form another generation that can think through the very complex challenges of public life? And it's kind of ironic that that was raised, and I just cannot help. Earlier this afternoon, Cardus launched our site called nextgenfellowship.ca. And this is us tackling that very question. So I'm not sure who actually put that question out there, but I just could not resist the timing of it. Check it out, nextgenfellowship.ca. We're thinking about that question, and yeah, there's a lot of difficult questions right now, but in a way, that's the biggest one. So thank you so much for spending these 90 minutes together with us. And at 5:30, you're going to receive a handout in your inbox outlining the discussion that we just had in a bit more succinct form. But before we take leave of each other, may I encourage you to make Cardus part of your regular life. First, many of you today have been making significant financial investments into Cardus. And on behalf of our whole team, thank you. And I deeply ask you to persevere in your commitment. Influence in the public arena, it's hard to measure. It often is only discernible over time. And your support, in fact, has kind of positioned Cardus as a leading think tank in Canada. We've become a spectacular platform to voice faithful perspective into public life. Second, share your opinion. Our team is constantly scanning not only the voices of the leading public intellectuals and thinkers. We want to live into the thinking of civil society, of business leaders, of the church, of teachers, of woodworkers, and of farmers. And I promise you that these voices will mold into the Cardus way of thinking. And then thirdly, I know that, and many of you mentioned this to me, Cardus can pile on with big reports and stuff like that. And yep, it's the business of our doing credible and thoughtful work. But you know what? Hit the executive summaries, touch the abstracts, and catch the articles, or check out the infographics, or hit the top lines. And if you have time, read in deeply. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll be back in another couple of months with this very same kind of conversation, a little bit different. May God bless you and your families. Goodbye.